In responding to Suella Braverman's damning indictment of his leadership, the Prime Minister has responded, or rather his office has responded, one of his minions, saying that actually the Prime Minister believes in action, not words. Pull the other one. What action? You've been sitting there hoping for the best on a wing and a prayer, not delivering on the British people's priorities and actually what you said stood on in that 2019 manifesto. I mean, we all remember Geoffrey Howe swinging his cricket bat at Mrs. Thatcher with his resignation statement. Well, this resignation statement, or rather this statement on her sacking, was more than a gentle knock. This was a fiery letter indeed. It was utterly scathing. Braverman's words aren't just a critique. They're a sledgehammer to Rishi Sunak's leadership style. She's not mincing her words at all. She was essentially telling Sunak that he's all hat and no cattle when it comes to tackling some of Britain's most pressing issues. And if you look at the tone of the letter, it's not just a wake-up call. This is a full-blown alarm bell ringing in the ears of Downing Street to the Conservative Party. So I have to say, look, this is heavyweight gloves off politics at its most brutally honest. And honestly, it's about time that someone said it as it is. That's why I'm going to miss Suella. You know, Suella Braverman must be the only politician sacked for actually telling the truth. I'll tell you that much for free. I think the most damning revelation for you at home to take away from this letter is her first-hand insight into what will happen tomorrow. Tomorrow, the Rwanda plan, the government's plan to tackle the small boats crisis, is in front of the Supreme Court. Now, even if the Supreme Court say, yep, this is permissible in British law, we can go ahead with this, no qualms on our side. Even then, Suella Braverman reveals that actually because Rishi Sunak has been utterly supine, that it will be subject to legal challenge after legal challenge. And that's despite, of course, Brexit giving us control over our lawmaking facilities and capabilities. And I'm afraid ruling out leaving the ECHR outright, the European Convention on Human Rights, so Strasbourg gets to decide what the British people can and can't have as their border policy, whether or not we can or can't have border controls in Britain. He basically shrugged his shoulders at Suella, that's what she reveals, and said, well, we ain't going to do that, so we have to hope for the best with the Rwanda plan. I'm afraid on a whole host of issues, like this weekend when we saw people wearing Hamas headbands on the streets of London, when we saw people desecrating war memorials, when we saw people shouting the most awful things about Jews and actually even arguing that Hitler was right, the most grotesque language we've seen used. That these all from the same people, by the way, who complain about Suella Braverman's use of language. I don't know about you, but I think this is what genuinely counts as racism and incitement. But Sunak's hesitation on this was viewed by Suella as a leadership flop as well. It's a national security risk, she even argues. When she's screaming for action against these hate marches and extremism, Sunak's response was an utterly damp squib. Right? With Britain facing radical threats that have been unseen for decades, we've got a Prime Minister who's more a fence sitter than a firebrand. Say what you want about Suella and her language, but I know which one I prefer at a moment like this. We don't have the time to be arguing about the need to monitor our tones and speak like a kid from a boarding school. It's not rocket science either to say that if you don't stop the boats, then you're not delivering for the British people. Immigration is Conservative voters' biggest priority. And his priority for the Rwanda plan is basically to say, well, it's our only plan. There is no plan B. It's a bit like waiting for a sunny day in Newcastle, frankly. It's hopelessly optimistic and utterly unprepared. If we lose, as I said, we're back to square one, thanks to his magical thinking and lack of a plan B. Braverman had a plan. Does Sunak even care? Right? He ignored her. He sidelined her. Again, I repeat that ECHR point. It's a betrayal of Sunak's, the trust that was placed in him by people like Suella, by the Conservative Parliamentary Party. And it's basically waving a legal white flag to every loophole out there. We're running a country or a courtroom. I think Suella Braverman wanted to run the country and Rishi Sunak wants to run a courtroom. And then, of course, she mentions betrayals of actually promises that Rishi Sunak made to Suella Braverman to secure her support. And frankly, she should never have supported him, because it's always been clear, really, that fishy Rishi, it can't be trusted. But she backed him. And actually, he's, well, had a spot of political amnesia about that. And, you know, I go back to this point about pledges. The 5k pledges he made, well, Britain needs action, mate, not just words, and certainly not empty promises. And I'm afraid you are quite the empty vessel. So good for Suella. This is a damning indictment on the Conservative Party and where they're at. And, you know, this ain't going to go away anytime soon. Rishi Sunak, I'm afraid, is somewhat snookered. Have you got what it takes to be a reasoned presenter? Well, send us a short clip of yourself to join@reasoned.uk and we might be seeing you on this very channel very soon indeed.